Welcome again. My name is Sabina Asanova. I work as a coordinator of the working group Clean Vehicles and Air Quality in Polis. Polis is a European-wide network bringing over 90 cities and regions together to work on innovation in transport. In this model, we will have a closer look into the charging infrastructure rollout that is needed to support the uptake of electric mobility. Please note that our attention in this model will go to the public charging infrastructure for passenger cars and vans. Let's get started. Aiming at accommodating the anticipated rapid uptake of electric vehicles, the charging infrastructure that will be developed in the cities should fit into a bigger puzzle and not be treated as a stand-alone activity. This can be achieved by developing a long-term strategy and planning on the local level. Let's see why it is important. Firstly, infrastructure has to be connected to the electricity network. This will have an impact on the electricity grid or can even overload the network. So it is crucial to think in advance how the network stability can be ensured. Moreover, if there is a need to upgrade the electricity grid, then the local authorities should also think about the workforce to realize the needed upgrades. Depending on the local situation, workforce has to be also assigned to install the charging points. Furthermore, it is important to remember that these charging points will take up space, and most likely public space. Therefore, space management and urban planning need to be taken into account. Let us also not forget that there is and will be charging infrastructure rollout for other modes of transport, such as public transport or new shared mobility services. In addition, the local authorities should take into account the development of the private and semi-private infrastructure. It is therefore important to ensure that the other rollouts are well monitored and harmonized. In an ideal situation, some of the infrastructure should be shared. As the last argument why charging infrastructure has to be seen in interaction with other factors is that the rollout, certainly in the early stages, require public support. So you want to spend public money effectively. While it might require serious planning and efforts to develop such a long-term strategy, the insights gained from this can be essential as it will help the local authorities to identify the needs and ultimately the most optimal locations for the charging infrastructure. Moreover, such a document will help to create a harmonized approach and link the developments taking place in the non-public charging infrastructure. Last but not least, it will avoid any short time investments that might turn out to be inefficient or even redundant in the long term. Here it is important to remember that the expected lifetime of the charging infrastructure is at least 7 years. So in case urban mobility policies and planning are constantly changing in your city, the risk of losing money due to the absence of a long-term vision is real. To illustrate it with an example, you build public on-street recharging points, and this street becomes car-free. Even if you reinstall the charging points, the investments associated with the grid upgrades and underground cables are lost for good. When developing this document, local authorities should take into account forecasts and changes related to urban planning, and in particular, the amount and types of parking spaces, both public and private. What also needs to be considered is which changes the fleets might undergo in the future. Will there be more or fewer cars? What categories and in which proportion they will be driving on the road? Are there any projections that private vehicle ownership will increase or decrease? Are there forecasts that shared mobility use will increase? Do the local authorities expect more citizens to opt for active mobility solutions such as walking and cycling or public transport? how dense traffic will get and how the traffic flows will look like. Are there any plans to introduce local urban vehicle access regulations or low emission zones? All these projections will help to draft future strategies, reducing the risk of failure. In some countries such as the Netherlands, several regions go a step further by joining the efforts in developing common inter-regional long-term strategy. Metropolitan region Amsterdam Electric, or in short MRA-E, is one of the good practices. Let's hear what this joint initiative is and what are the advantages of developing a joint strategy.
Hello, my name is Pieter Looijestijn. I'm the project manager charging infrastructure at MRA Electric, or more easily said, the Amsterdam region. So we are a joint public venture of local and regional governments, determined to bring down CO2 emissions and air quality by stimulating electromobility. We bring together the efforts of over 70 municipalities spread over 3 provinces in the northwestern part of the Netherlands. We believe a vital condition for the success of electric vehicles is good public charging infrastructure. In the end, over 70% of all our inhabitants will have to rely on on-street charging stations for charging their car. But clearly there's much more to it than just charging stations, as by themselves they do not reduce CO2 emissions or improve air quality. Especially the uptake of vehicles other than privately owned cars requires a lot of our attention. For instance, logistics and car sharing. So what are the advantages in developing a common strategy? Mobility by itself travels and goes across local, regional or national borders, obviously. It would make no sense for a city to just focus on its own city and allow fossil fueled cars to drive in every day. A common strategy allows us to develop coherent policies and projects across the region. Both inhabitants and businesses, they know what to expect in our region. For instance, the demand-driven policy for charging infrastructure is broadly accepted in our region. Also, in such a developing sector, there are limited resources, there's a limited capacity and knowledge available. And we can bundle this at a central organization that actively supports its members. And when new developments keep coming up, we jointly develop answers to that.
Hi there, my name is Floris Jousma. I work for FIER as a clean mobility specialist, and today I want to tell you something about the EV charging basics and why this is important in relation to the rollout of recharging infrastructure. And before we continue in the course, we will provide some high-level information on the basics of EV charging regarding the standards and the interoperability and why this is important. So why is EV recharging infrastructure important? To be honest, there is really no sustainable mobility business case without recharging. Just as a vehicle that's running on gasoline, of course you need to get the vehicle moving, and for that you need to have electricity in the batteries of your vehicle. So it's very important that there is sufficient recharging infrastructure available, that the charging speed is sufficient so that it delivers enough power. It should be reliable and also user-friendly. If we look at the history of the recharging infrastructure and some concerns of EV drivers, looking at the slide and the McKinsey EV consumer survey from 2016 and 2019, we can see that there has been a little bit of a shift towards the concerns of EV drivers. There used to be a lot of concern about the car experience and the vehicle availability and also maybe the price, but we see now that this has become less and less. So a bigger concern nowadays is about the battery and the charging, especially the battery degradation and the charging availability. And as said before, we should take these concerns away, because it should be as easy as filling a tank with gas. Also looking at the concerns of policymakers and authorities, it's of course very important that policymakers and authorities are aware of what the risks are regarding the recharging infrastructure. And some of the risks that it can be like a lack of safety, high operating costs, but also when installing maybe the wrong kind of recharging infrastructure later on in the future, there could be sunk assets. And what's also very important is that there will be no vendor lock-in, which could cause tariff spikes or maybe a lack of access to data. And also, to take these concerns away, it's very important for policymakers and authorities to understand that the whole infrastructure market has to be interoperable and based on open standards that are accessible to everyone and also for new players. If we're looking at what is very important for the rollout of the EV recharging infrastructure, there are basically 4 main categories or KPIs to consider for the rollout. One of the most important is that there's sufficient coverage of recharging infrastructure. This can be measured, of course, with different metrics. It can be measured as to how many electric vehicles are there now and in the future, how many people are there in my country, or how many square kilometers, so different ways of measuring. And also specifically for measuring the fast recharging points, it could be useful to measure that, for instance, per 100 kilometers of highway. And all these metrics, maybe there are even more metrics, can be measured on a national level, but it could also be useful to measure it on a regional level, for instance on what we call in Europe a NUTS 2 or 3 level. What's also very important for recharging is that we talk of is seamless charging. Seamless charging is very consumer-centric, it's very focused on the consumers, and it makes sure that everything goes well so that consumers, the EV drivers, can properly charge without facing many challenges. And this consists of cross-border interoperability. That's both national and international roaming and activation that is possible, and that there is appropriate assistance when something goes wrong in the right language also. That's also important. And another one of the major KPIs is related to payment, where it's very important to ensure that there are transparent charging costs. That means transparent, that it's transparent beforehand, before the charging starts, but also afterwards, that the bills are clear and everything. And also something to consider is to have something in place at the recharging that users can charge contactless. So that we also call that maybe ad hoc charging, where someone could pay with a credit card, for instance. But what's important, also related to the roaming aspect, is that users would not need to have a separate contract registering at every MSP or CPO to be able to charge anywhere they would like. It would be much better for the EV uptake if they could have like one contract, one charging card or one app that you can basically use everywhere to charge. And then also considering, especially for the fast charging locations, mainly at highways and such, it's very important that when EV drivers have to wait there before their car is charged again enough to continue their trip, that there are enough facilities available, where you can think of food, drinks, restaurants, and other facilities. So when we're looking at the EV charging market and what we need to enable all these KPIs, it's very important to be aware that there are of course, many standards and protocols, and that's both on the hardware side as on the software side. Concerning the hardware side, of course, a plug from a charger should fit to a car, where in Europe, nowadays, most of the chargers allow us to use the Type 2 or Mannekes charging, that we call it. And also regarding fast charging, it's the CCS2, the combo. And when we look at the protocols, so the open standard protocols that are very important, it's mainly between the vehicle and the charge point. That's mainly covered by the ISO 15118 standard that is in the meantime mutually adopted by both the manufacturers of the cars, OEMs, but also the charge point manufacturers. If we look at the connection, the protocols between the charge point and the charge point operator, that's also fairly standard nowadays. It's mostly used as OCPP. But where it gets interesting and also more complicated is more everything between the charge point operators and the e-mobility service providers or the e-roaming platforms or the clearing houses, where there have been many protocols being developed. One of them, for instance, OCPI, but other ones are OCHP or OICP or EMIP, and there it's not really one standard yet, but that's something we're working on. And going forward to the stakeholders that we'll find in the charging market, you can, for instance, think about, we have an energy supplier because we need the energy for the vehicles, then we need an infrastructure for transporting the energy, but also for the hardware of the charging point themselves. And then we have all these services as well that concern, for instance, the payment services and the roaming platforms and from the mobility service provider and such. And you can think of that, so this whole process, there's the delivery of energy, and it has to be registered how much it was or how long you've been charging, and it has to be paid for, of course. So that's why all these parties need to cooperate with each other and that the whole payment process goes well. So as explained, one of the most important KPIs is seamless charging that allows roaming for user, or to be able to pay with only one mean of payment. And to give an example where then also the open protocols, and that's important that everyone use the same protocol, comes into place, is with this example of an EV driver that can pay with one mean of payment at 3 different charging points, can be from many different operators. That goes all well, but then at the 4th something goes wrong, and this has to do with either protocols that are different, but it can also have to do with contracts that are not there. As you can see, for instance, the roaming hub A, there's no contract with roaming hub B, and therefore they are not connected. And this can be quite a challenge for users, because then suddenly they thought they could charge somewhere, but they can't, and they would have to first register a new account at some MSP or a CPO to be able to charge. And this can be very frustrating and annoying, and of course it also has to do with giving away all your data every time that an operator asks for it. So then going back to what is interoperability exactly in the EV ecosystem. Interoperability is actually the ability of the vehicles, the chargers, the networks and the management systems to interact and manage the data to ensure the safety, but also the compatibility of the equipment and the protocols. It ensures the functionality, it ensures the system reliability, but also the system availability. And this can all have to do with all the different aspects between the energy supplier, the vehicle, the charger operator, and the whole back office and payment systems, for instance. Why the market and the technology should be open and transparent, that's also a very important question. So having explained what interoperability is, it's also important to explain why the market and the technology should be open and transparent, and how we do that, reach that by enabling interoperability. So what it enables and why it should be open and transparent is to enable the acceptance of EVs. As explained, it's about enabling the roaming, the payment process, etc. And what that also does is that it enables all the users the access to the recharging. It's about the software again, it's about the open protocols, it's about the same hardware plugs and everything. What it also does is that it reduces the risks of premature obsolescence of assets, or also what we call the sunk assets, by making sure that there are certain standards and everyone's working on the same standards. It's not that there are investments being done in certain other possible solutions which then become obsolete. What that helps with is that knowing what to develop, which standards are going to be used, it's easier to plan and to meet the expectations on the performance and the costs. It also has to do with, of course, for instance, the testing and the safety. It's much more predictable. And what that also does is that it provides the performance, consistency and the reliability. And taking all these aspects into account, and why it's important is because we are facing a huge challenge when it comes to all the millions of recharging stations that we'll be needing in the future. And interoperability is key to maximize the investment returns in the industry and the user satisfaction. So I hope that I've been able to explain a bit on a high level the basics of EV recharging infrastructure and why interoperability and using standards for both software and hardware is so important to enable the rollout of the recharging infrastructure. And yeah, that's me signing off, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
The rollout should provide sufficient capacity and availability of the EV users to be able to charge as conveniently and flexibly as possible, ensuring that the range anxiety is reduced and the EV drivers' demands are met. How can this be done in practice? Earlier we have discussed the advantages of the long-term strategy and talked about the key performance indicators. Equipped with this information, few further steps needs to be developed in detail. Step number 1. Define the required amount of charging points. This is an issue that keeps many authorities awake. The truth is that there is no straightforward answer to this. However, by understanding certain developments on the ground, this should be achievable. To start with, as has been discussed before, it is important to have good estimates of both current and future projections of the traffic flows and the number of vehicles. This also means that the local actors need to understand which groups of EV users drive on their roads and what are their needs, as well as their routes. It should be kept in mind that very often the origins and destination of the trips are not bound by the administrative geographical areas, and therefore alignment between the strategies and the charging networks of different cities and regions is strongly advised. The next important thing to remember is how the capacity grid in the area and its readiness level. Planning the deployment of charging stations in area where grid capacity is readily available can considerably reduce connection and network costs. It is helpful if the local authorities understand the developments that are taking place in the sector of private or semi-public charging. In the areas where there is potential for semi-public as well as private charging infrastructure, there might be less need for the public charging points. What we see in many European cities is that the local public authorities are only willing to step in where there is less potential for the private or semi-private charging possibilities, as you can see in the example of the Belgian city of Arnhem. A similar approach can be found in other European cities, such as Berlin, Brussels, and most of the Dutch cities, aiming at developing charging infrastructure on private grounds as much as possible, and then continue with the public. The last point to mention is that we live in a world of rapid advancements in the battery technologies and technologies such as autonomous and connected driving. This should be also kept in mind in defining the numbers of the charging points. The number of charging points is linked to the location of these points. To get it right, the first thing to do is to look at the traffic flow and number of the EVs. We will discuss two widely used ways of selecting locations for charging infrastructure. These two methods can be and are mostly used in combination. Modeling or forecasting of the charging demand approach is a centralized approach where in most cases public authorities base their planning of the infrastructure on models that forecast how the future demand will develop. This method is very often applied for the rollout of the basic infrastructure, when there is little or no interest from the private sector to invest. The advantages of this model is that it helps to ensure just and correct geographical spread of the charging infrastructure, preventing the concentration of charging stations or points exclusively in the most profitable locations, but also looking into weaker socio-economic parts, guaranteeing social inclusion. Applying this model can also help the development of the charging infrastructure in the lower dense, peri-urban or rural areas. In such areas with low population density, the public infrastructure must be deployed strategically at locations where it is used to a maximum extent. This could be, for instance, at locations where people typically remain for sufficiently long period to recharge their vehicles, such as stores or restaurants, but also different types of public access buildings, such as hospitals, museums, theaters, universities, or stadiums, as well as public transport stations, such as airports, ports, train and bus stations. On this, you can have a look at the SPARK model approach, which is a great example.
John, could you please tell us how you have applied the SPARK city model in Rotterdam?
Yeah, in the Netherlands we foresee a very strong exponential growth of the electric vehicles in the country, and that this will also be in Rotterdam as a city. And all these vehicles, they need to charge, so also the demand of charging stations will rise. And we want to know what we're talking about. What is our what's the challenge we have to face? The SPARK City model helped us because it puts, based on trends, we put in policy trends, socio-economic figures of the real city, so our own city. It predicts how fast and where in the city the growth will take place. And it predicts how many charging stations we need at different periods over the future, so 2020, 25 and 30. Well, this was for us very useful. We use this for other colleagues. Listen, we're really facing a challenge. We use this for discussions with the grid operator, because they also need to know where in the city on the electric network demands will take place. We use this for as a basis for public tenders, for new charging stations, for if you talk about new development plans, city development, redevelopment plans, where okay, take care, make sure that there's some charging place for charging as well in the future plans.
What are the main advantages that you see in the SPARK City model, and also disadvantages of this model?
Yeah, the main advantages were, like I said before, we used it in different ways, and it helped us as a sort of communication tool as well. And not only we've got this map where in the city the growth will take, but it also had a fact sheet where all the totals, the total number of charging stations, total number of vehicles was brought together. So this was all very useful, but it had some disadvantages as well. It's a picture of today, of a moment. So all the assumptions of socioeconomic numbers and figures of the city, they will change over time. So you need to update it and recalculate. It only looks at personal vehicles, so not the transport sector. So it's not the complete picture of the power demand. We need extra input to get a complete picture. The results, you really have to look at the results with the knowledge you have of the city, because sometimes it wants to put a charging station in a certain area where there's no space at all, because it's full with other pedestrian area over it. So you really have to validate the first results. And sometimes it's not completely logical that it predicts somewhere, but overall the general figures and results are very. We work with it. Yeah.
I'd like to hear from you. What are the plans for the future? How do you see the charging infrastructure developing in Rotterdam, and what is the role of the Spark model in this?
Yeah. It's the charging stations and the demand for charging stations is growing very, very fast at the moment. And what we see is a trend that charging stations are much more placed based on how the existing charging stations are used. If they're always occupied, if a lot of electricity is being charged, when the charging stations are full, we just add a new one. Makes sense to add a new one, and in that way you can also let your network of charging stations grow. And we do this with real figures, real data from historic. And if you take the historical data, we can predict half year up front. We can place, so we will be ready for the next half year. So it's a completely different way of rolling out the network, and that's what we see now, and that's what's going to happen. So we won't place with the Spark City model in the future. It has been very useful for us, and especially for cities that are starting up the rolling out, or cities if you have to, as a city, you can reserve parking places up front. So when the demand will come, you've got already make sure that the place is there. And some cities do that as well. We don't, but that's also then Spark City is very useful as well. But for us, well, we were very happy to have it, to use it. But now we will continue on other data-based predictions.
The second method that cities use is the demand-driven approach. In this case, current or future EV users who have no access to the private charging points can request the installation of the charging point close to their homes if certain criteria are met. One of the most common criteria is the distance from your house to the charging point. To repeat, this approach is often applied in combination with the modeling approach that we have discussed before. It is believed that this strategy has been proven to be effective in convincing consumers to switch to electric vehicles. Examples are Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Leuven. Okay, so we have discussed the number and locations for the charging points. The next step is to identify appropriate power levels. The power and therefore the speed with which the EV batteries can be charged and recharged at any given charging point determines how and where the charging point will be used, and therefore defining the power levels depending on the location is crucial. The amount of charging points, their locations, and power outputs are intertwined. As mentioned above, relatively low power charging points may be well suited to locations where people tend to park for longer periods, such as at home or work. However, as vehicles charge slower at lower power, more charging points are needed to facilitate the vehicle user's demands, likely putting more strain on the public domain. On the other hand, at times when drivers want to spend little time charging their vehicles, they may want to use faster charging points, which translates into a higher cost, for example, on long-range highway drives. A higher share of high-power charging points may reduce the need for charging points overall, but this is very much depends on their locations and on the EV users' preferences and needs. Another important aspect to take into account is the grid. Considering existing or future grid constraints or making use of the existing grid capacity is crucial for the successful planning and rollout and can seriously reduce the connection and network costs. It will also help to avoid rather unpleasant surprises in the future. The technologies such as smart charging and preparing for the vehicle-to-grid solutions can also help relieve the grid, shape up the peaks, and help make the more optimal use of sustainable energy. There are various examples that cities and regions or even countries adopt to provide information about the current capacity grids to the local actors. Get inspired by the UK Open Power Networks project, where the project provides an overview of the grid capacity on a nationwide scale. German standard toll deserves mention as a similar tool demonstrating the grid capacities on different levels.
We have discussed the forecasting and on-demand approaches. However, with the currently still limited number of charging points, this might not be an issue yet in most cities. But if we want our mobility to be 100% electric in the future, the locations where charging infrastructure is being rolled out have to be thought through. That means that a rather ad hoc approach can pose an issue to the urban spaces. When planning the rollout, it is crucial to minimize visual pollution, ensure safety, and reduce the occupancy of the public space, especially in the cities. The visual pollution can be reduced by, for example, installing small, compact recharging points, by deploying recharging poles with multiple connectors, or by allowing multiple vehicles to be charged simultaneously. Additionally, combining multiple services in one device, for instance, lampposts, telecom boxes, can also be rather useful. As many charging points will be in public spaces, at no time they should pose any health risks. This means, for example, that cables and connectors should be stored properly and there is no risk to be exposed to electricity when passing the charging point or when using it. The fact is that the higher the occupancy rate, the less charging infrastructure would be needed. For example, one car charging all night means that the occupancy rate is decreased. Installing the right amount of recharging points and selecting the most suitable locations, and most importantly, choosing the right power levels increases the chances of achieving a higher occupancy rate and thus less use of public space. This can be fostered by the parking-related policies, by, for example, restricting the use of the electric vehicles enabled parking lots by non-electric vehicle users, as well as positively discriminating the EV users by applying different parking rates. Although this is still not the most popular choice, the shared infrastructure should become more popular in the future. The most recent standard protocols for the hardware and the communication between vehicles and charging points will allow this practice to become more recognized and hopefully more used in the future, thanks to interoperability. This might help reduce space needed for the charging. Of course, there are additional hurdles to overcome, such as solving the situation with the booking systems. What if, for example, a car is charging and the public transport needs to charge at the same time? How do you solve this issue? Well, looking at the future, we believe that this will be solved, and therefore sharing charging infrastructure can bring the costs and occupancy of the public spaces down. There are some ideas how to limit the use of the public space. For instance, in development, where your home charger can be rented while you're not using it, considering electricity costs and expenses associated with the charging point, and renting it out as a sort of an Airbnb. This way, the occupancy rate of the private charging point is increased, while there is less burden on the public or semi-public charging infrastructure. Another example of the efficient use of the public space is the development of the so-called e-hubs or e-mobility hubs. These hubs bring together various shared e-mobility transport modes in one dedicated spot, usually close to the public transport hub. This way, deviating the traffic congestion, promoting the use of shared mobility, and attempting to reduce private car ownership. These can be used by private users as well by the light logistics operators. A very good example of this can be found in Belgium. The city of Leuven plans to introduce 50 mobility hubs over the next 3 years to improve multimodality in the city. The hubs will bring together different transport modes in one place, such as a bus stop, electric vehicle charging stations, and various shared vehicles, including electric cars, bicycles, and scooters. But now, moving on from Europe to Southeast Asia, let's see how our partners in Pasig work towards creating e-mobility hubs.
As part of the course, I will be answering a couple of questions concerning design studio that we facilitated at the Technical University of Berlin in cooperation with City of Pasig. It is particularly relevant for this module because we dealt with the issue of location of charging stations within the public space of Pasig. So I think the questions will give us an opportunity to reflect on what kind of planning considerations were relevant in the process of designing charging stations in the city of Pasig. The first question is, what kind of considerations are relevant in the process of designing charging stations except of technical feasibility and this basic function of charging? And I think a number of answers is possible here, but just to get right away to the point, I believe that we can think about charging stations the same as we think about any other service that is visible in a public space and generates movement. So it's not only about technical feasibility, but of course the way people will use it, the way it looks, the way it kind of generates or does not generate economic activities and benefits the communities which are around that service. We can imagine really a charging station which has a low visual quality, is kind of hidden and doesn't support any other sort of activities that would be desired in a specific space. Or we could really think of a charging station that adds to the neighborhood or the location where it is placed in terms of different spheres of urban development, so economy, visual quality, people's movements, multimodality. And those are the considerations which are definitely relevant in the planning process. So the next question is, how did we reflect on this context in the design studio in Pasig? And before I answer, I would just explain that the design studio was conducted with local students at the Technical University of Berlin in cooperation with the city of Pasig and SOLUTIONSplus experts who also contributed with their ideas and knowledge. But really, broadly speaking, we directly try to tackle what I mentioned just a second ago. To think about the stations in a broader scale, reflect on it in terms of the way it can benefit economically to the surrounding areas, the way it can add to the visual qualities of a space, and the existing transportation connections. So you could see those criteria in the table that is presented. We really look at the whole city, but then of course we narrow down to several proposals which could really be best fitting to the local context because of those criteria that we shown. So we were planning for a space which can reinforce connections between different modes of transportation, but also in a way benefit the local community by introducing movements of new types of vehicles and potentially some kind of economic activities around it. And I think you can exactly see it on the design presented in here. And the final question now is, will it be implemented, and in which ways we cooperate with other SOLUTIONSplus cities? So of course we need to see to what degree the idea is implementable, but what we hope for is that this kind of methodology can be used either in Pasig or different cities and really inform the decision making on the location of the stations and the way they can really benefit different spheres of urban development. And the second part of the question, we hope to work with all of the cities within SOLUTIONSplus, but as for now, we did cooperate with the city of Quito, Pasig, and in this round of design studio with Montevideo and Dar es Salaam. And of course, each of these cities has different challenges, so we answer to different questions, but charging stations and the aspect of multimodality repeats practically everywhere. For example, in Montevideo, we're looking at charging stations for buses, but also try to reconceptualize the space around the bus stops in the city. And in Dar es Salaam, we think how the new BRT stations can in a way link with e-mobility vehicles and what kind of spatial solutions would be feasible in that context. And of course, we hope to continue that interesting work with the remaining cities within the consortium.
Earlier in the module, we have discussed the need for a long-term strategy, looking at the future in combination with the urgent need to decarbonize to reach climate neutrality. When talking about electromobility, it is important to think about the sources of electricity electric vehicles are charged with. Ideally, this should be green electricity coming from renewable sources, and therefore, when developing charging infrastructure, both generating and managing the electricity is important. For some inspiration, let's virtually travel to the city of Arnhem in the Netherlands and hear more about how they ensure that the energy used at the charging points is clean.
So how is renewable energy for e-mobility generated in Arnhem? What is the capacity?
Yeah, in Arnhem we have, near the harbor in Arnhem, we have a solar field of 10 megawatts and 4 wind turbines are being erected as we speak, which have an additional 10 megawatts. Okay, we have 250 charging points in Arnhem, which are connected to the back office of the charge point operator in Arnhem. And the back office of the charge point operator is connected to the IEMS, which is the software platform, the energy management system, which is operated by the City of Arnhem and which is also situated at the storage facility in the new harbour.
Can you explain how it works in practice?
Yes, the IEMS is, as I said, operated by the City of Arnhem and is situated in the new harbour in Arnhem, near the storage facility. And what we do with the IEMS is actually collecting data continuously, data about consumption, but also about the production and what the status of the storage facility is. And next to this data collection, we do a forecast of the consumption and the production. And with this data and this forecast, we can suggest actions to take aimed at the optimal use of the renewable energy produced by the solar field and by the wind turbines. For instance, we can then decide whether to use the energy directly at the same moment to bring it to the charges of the cars or to the shore-to-ship power in the harbour. Or we can store it for a while, or we can say to the charging devices, well, you can use the energy now, but you cannot use more than, for instance, so many kilowatts at this moment.
What are the main challenges faced when integrating renewable energy and electric vehicles?
Yeah, we distinguish two different use cases in this clean mobile energy project. One case is that you have all the equipment and the production and the consumption behind the meter, so not using the grid, and then you can take direct actions, you can intervene where you want, and that's rather straightforward. But if you use the grid, as we do in Arnhem, then you have a very complex situation, because the production means, but also the consumption is in the hands of different stakeholders. So you need a lot of agreements, you need a lot of price deals, who's paying what to whom, and the most important question is who is in charge of distributing the locally produced renewable energy. So the challenge is in our project is to find this stakeholder who can do that. And I need to say that in the Netherlands we have this energy law, and this does not help to make this easier, because in the energy law, for instance, you have to pay twice. You have to pay tax twice when you use a storage facility. But in the end, the most important challenge is to get a positive business case out of this integrated energy management system, because if you can make money with it, then it will be easier to find a stakeholder who wants to do this.
Hello, I'm Reggie. I work for ICLEI's Sustainable Mobility team based in Freiburg in Germany, and I'm also the Innovation Manager for the Horizon 2020 Green Charge project. If you'd like to find more about this project, you can find our website online. So, following on from the session about the strategic positioning of electric mobility stations, I'd like to talk to you today about increasing the visibility of these charging stations and trying to reinforce their use, their correct use. So we're going to talk about some elements of design at a high level. So considering the use of colour, branding, lighting, consistency and branding of signage. So just taking a global look across the world, there's, as you would expect, across the world there are different depictions of electric mobility, but they show some common aspect, such as a vehicle, often a car, with a plug attached to it. It would be good to have a common standard internationally, but we need to respect local themes and local iconography that's attached to transport modes, and as long as it follows some clearly recognisable elements, I think this is probably as much as we can expect going forward. Having said that, there are different aspects that are important to consider. So where do you put the signage? Is it at the charging station, or is it en route to the charging point? And does it contain regulatory information, or is it more about marketing and publicity? So you can see different examples of this on the screen. So there are two different principal ways to help people to find the charging point locations. One is physical and the other is digital, and ideally these should work together in unison. So physically, this might be a situation where there are standalone electric vehicle charging points just for cars, for example, or it might be more of a mobility hub, such as the Mobile Punkt concept that arose in Bremen, one of the green charge cities, that is designed to provide many different modes of transport and, more importantly, interchange between them. Second, on the digital side, this could be a specific operator for one brand of charging station, or more ideally, this is part of a roaming concept or a mobility as a solution concept. So starting with towards the top of the transport hierarchy with powered two-wheelers, it's important to provide visibility for these. These can range from battery charging stations where users leave their battery and go away and come back and collect it, to more quicker battery swapping stations, and these can also be integrated quite easily with electric mobility, with electric charging solutions from renewable energy. So obviously these are lighter users of energy, so the smaller solar power the requirement is, and this can be a good way of both promoting green energy use and promoting the existence of the charging station itself. Moving on to buses, well, you might question why buses actually need high visibility charging stations when drivers will regularly use routes and know where they are, but this is as much to stop obstruction from other vehicles accidentally, or from other vehicles who are able to use those charging points from using them instead of buses, and that there have been example instances of this where charging stations haven't been made visible enough that they're only for buses. And finally, there are some transferable lessons from car charging points. So this includes considering easily recognizable common designs, using pavement markings and lighting for nighttime use, particularly during the winter. And don't forget electric vehicles themselves. These are big, prominent vehicles. These can be branded. When there's lots of vehicles together, this can really highlight the existence of electric vehicle charging points, particularly in the early stages of their use. So having shared vehicles and fleet vehicles mixed in with public charging points is probably not a bad idea. But be sensitive about design. So obviously electric charging is still relatively new. It hasn't been through many iterations in terms of urban design, so there may be some conflicts with people's perception of how an urban area should look. There are new solutions such as underground parking, use of different materials, and wall-mounted solutions, but always consider the visibility of these. So further considerations, there's a long list here that I won't go through in detail, but this includes thinking about all different types of users, what might they need in terms of visibility, and thinking about marketing different aspects such as the green energy, smart energy element that I talked about earlier, so users get more of a positive feedback from their charging experience. Having said that, there might be some problems that become encountered. Some of these include overstay by electric vehicle users after their charging session, the wrong type of EV being used, so I mentioned buses and vans earlier, and also what's called icing, so people with non-electric vehicle engine cars occupying stations either deliberately or more often accidentally because they're not aware of the existence of the charging point. So potential enforcement measures, these from a user's perspective, this could include notifications all the way through to a termination of a contract, taking a deposit or issuing a fine or other things. And for non-electric vehicle users and electric vehicle users, I guess the last resort is actually setting some regulations in for the removal of vehicles, but this is obviously an expensive and potentially less friendly option to get people on board. So in Green Charge we're testing out some booking systems for visitor parking places. This has evolved from a simple spreadsheet, and we're now testing out an app that would allow users to secure a reservation for a charging spot in advance, and we'll see how this works and how different regimes for enforcing the stay actually work in practice. So to keep up with that, follow the Green Charge website. You can see our plans in our deliverables that are online, and also refer to the Sustainable Transport Forum's recent work in this area. So thank you for listening to this short overview, and I wish you great luck with the rest of your learning.